So let's get started. First up is the City of Colwood, and this is Mark Downton, Manager Information Technology.
Good morning, everyone. So I wanted to talk about our Azure workload migration project that we did this spring. And first, a bit about the City of Colwood. We're in Vancouver Island, next to Victoria, and between Victoria and Langford. And the city sits on the land, or the ancestral land of the Songhees and Capsup nations. And we're an IT shop of 3 people. And currently we're a VMware environment and an existing M365 customer. So the goals of this project was to retire our on-premise hardware and have no hardware moving forward, eventually. But at first we'll just migrate some workloads to Azure, and then once that's built out, learn about the platform. And if we could address disaster recovery, that would be a bonus. Oh, I see I'm a slide behind. So I've been in IT a long time. You can see Bill Gates in the bottom left there, and I'm in the top right. And I've been coming to MISA since 2008, and at the MISA in 2011, Microsoft was there presenting their vision of Office 365. And I remember watching that presentation and just going, no one's going to touch that. Like, we want to run our workloads on premise, we're distrustful of the cloud, we're government, we can't put our stuff up there. But years later, we have a bit more comfort with the cloud, and I'm getting tired, and I'm happy to pay someone to run my infrastructure. So where do we begin? How do you even pronounce Azure? I asked Copilot, and Copilot says it's supposed to be like amazing. But I think that's wrong. I just say Azure, and I'll continue to do that through the presentation. So if you've ever logged into Azure, when you get to the landing page, it's pretty busy, and immediately you feel a little bit overwhelmed, and you think, I guess I better read the manual. So I was able to get a copy of the manual, and I got to about page 3, and then I thought, well, maybe we could hire someone to do this project with us. So if you go to the Azure Marketplace landing page for Microsoft, you can see a list of partners that are certified to work with Microsoft, and CompuGen was one. We have an existing relationship with CompuGen. So I chose to work with them, and they have a little package to build an Azure landing zone. And phase 1 of that would be just to identify workloads that would be appropriate for migration. And also we wanted to explore if there was any Microsoft funding available. I thought if we're going to pay forever, maybe Microsoft could help us get us into that platform. I did this on my own, but your partner could help you. There's a solution assessment request that you can do through Microsoft, and it'll help determine your readiness for migration to Azure. And I should note there's another solution assessment there that you can do for Copilot as well, which we did this summer just to see if your data is in a good place for going to Copilot. So after reaching out to Microsoft, they got back to me right away and explained that I'd be running Block 64 on premise. And Block 64 is an application that will look at your infrastructure and ultimately generate a Power BI report for you, so you can see costs, dependencies between your workloads, and ultimately help you make that business decision whether it's worth going that route. I should note, to run Block 64, you have to give it local admin privileges, privileges to VMware, Office 365 admin, and it's going to expose your entire licensing with Microsoft. So you have to be comfortable with doing that. So once we ran Block 64, it helped answer these questions, like is it feasible to move the application? Does it make sense? Is there going to be latency issues? What are the cost considerations? What does licensing look like? In our case, our licensing, we have a Windows Server Standard Core, so that allows you to run on-premise and in the cloud for 6 months as you transition, but you have to choose one or the other after that. If you have a data center license, then you can run workloads concurrently, and that'll be a cheaper model for you moving forward. So after we ran Block 64, this slide's kind of busy, but what I'm interested in is where I circled in red is the cost. So this would be moving 9 servers to Azure, and it'd be about $650 a month, based on a 3-year commit, and that we brought our licenses with us. So you can play in this report all different scenarios around licensing, about right-sizing your virtual machines. And in the next slide, I'm doing a 1-year commit, and I'm renting the licenses, so the cost has jumped up to over $1,800 a month. So when you're budgeting for this, the answer is it depends, and whether you have your licenses that you can bring with you and how long you want to lock in for. Now, another consideration was backup. So to do backups in Azure, that would be a little under $500 a month. But that combined, the monthly rental for consumption and backups, I was still looking at about $1,500 a month, or $18,000 a year, or $90,000 over 5 years. So this is considerably cheaper than buying new hardware, buying 3 new servers and a new disk array. So it seemed compelling to continue this. Another consideration is carbon. It's certainly a hot topic of a lot of councils. So according to Block 64, I would save over 17,000 kilograms of carbon by running these workloads in Azure. And then not to mention just our own electrical savings at City Hall. So Block 64 identified a number of potential candidates. So we moved over a domain controller, a legacy Exchange server, and a file server. We also looked at some maybe workloads that we haven't moved yet, the GIS or Tempest server or Dynamics, and we have a remote desktop server that maybe we turn into virtual desktops. But then some didn't make sense, like our phone system or security system, print server too, where we'd be sending traffic up and back down again. So those are down the road. And then the last bit before we started building was, would there be any funding available? So CompuGen applied on our behalf, and they were successful. But then I said no, because it would have required to move all our workloads at once and make it worthwhile for Microsoft. And I wanted to have a more cautious approach where we moved just a few machines and then got to know the platform and see if it would really work for us. So after we got the results from Block 64, we were ready to build. First 4 questions on the slide were answered by Block 64, and then we went on to doing design workshops. And we started with some design principles about the data would be in Canada, it would be secure, it'd be scalable, and we'd leverage our existing authentication that we already use in Microsoft Entra. So the first thing that we built were management groups. And management groups are the containers that your subscriptions fit into. And the subscriptions are the agreements that we have with Microsoft, and that's what you pay for each month, and they're based on consumption. And so the topology of that sort of looks like this. We have some high-level management groups, and underneath that, eventually 3 subscriptions. One would be for a test environment, one for production, and then one for shared services, which are networking and authentication, and a domain controller and whatnot would be in there. And the advantage of this architecture is, say, if we look at our test subscription, you could give permissions to that group. Users could play in there without impacting other areas of the tenant. And then likewise, you could create a policy on one of those management groups that would only apply to that subscription. An example of a policy would be shutting off the servers after 4 o'clock, Monday to Friday, so that they're not running up billing cycles. So if we look in our Azure webpage, you can see what it would look like. We have a number of management groups with the subscriptions nested below them. And then inside the subscriptions are resource groups. And resource groups ultimately hold resources that are a virtual machine or disk or networking. So it's quite a complex build. The next bit to address was the networking. So we just had the tunnel from City Hall going into our shared services landing zone. And then out of the shared services, we had routing that went to the production and non-production landing zones. So at this point, we had connectivity, and we're almost ready to go, except we still had to set up security, naming conventions, tagging, policies, role-based access control, monitoring, alerting, backup, and recovery. So that was where it was nice working with a vendor to take care of all those details. Once that was complete, we moved on to actually migrating some workloads. So, and testing those once they were running, and then just getting some instruction on how to manage this new environment. So once your instance was set up, to do a migration, you actually create a new project in Azure, and it'll get you to install a virtual machine on premise and identify the workloads that you want to migrate. So we only moved one. We moved our old Exchange server up, and we wanted to do this just so we understood the process. But moving forward, we'll probably just retire machines on premise and create new ones in Azure. We also found that we could restore directly from Veeam. Currently, we're VMware, and our backups are in Veeam. And once you point Veeam to your Azure tenant, it sees your subscriptions, and all you have to do is choose what the appropriate resources are, and voila, you have a new virtual machine in Azure. And then finally, you can just select, create a new virtual machine, and 5 minutes later, you have a new copy of Windows 2022 data center running. So that was the goal, was really to spin up new machines easily and without any hardware. So once we had a few servers running, we did some testing, and we had some lessons on how to do backups, how to manage this, how to patch. And we received the as-built documentation, and what we have now is 3 Windows server running and 1 firewall. And then we're ready for sort of the next phase to address these maybe workloads. Once again, the goal was maybe one day we won't have hardware on premise, and how do we get there? And I think the analogy is sort of like when we first started using Office 365, everyone was just using Exchange, and then we started to add more services, and I see this slow migration of workloads going over to Azure in the same way. So my final thoughts on this project was, this was a departure for us in terms of hiring someone to build it. In the past, I would have got a manual, read the manual, tried to figure it out myself. And I think the complexity of the builds are just getting too great. So you want to hire someone that has that knowledge, and then we can maintain it. And knowing that it was built correctly, it's in the cloud. We want to make sure the security is right, that the access is right. So it's grateful to work with CompuGen on that. And now that we have this platform, we can actually start to learn about it, because before it was just sort of a concept without having a thing to play with. It's really hard to learn. And I think my goal of no on-premise hardware is likely not going to happen. We're probably going to always require a domain controller on-premise and a few servers like our security system or print server. But most of the things that we have on-premise will eventually end up in Azure, I believe. And then the last bit is, on the island, I always think about the mega thrust and, losing the building, and what does that look like? And we could quickly restore everything into Azure now from our Veeam backups, which I have in the cloud. So that gives me a lot of comfort to have this DR site that we didn't have before.